Welcome. On behalf of the Council for Emerging National Security Affairs, my name is William Denn, and I'm honored to be joined with us today for our interview series with Mr. Richard Clark. Mr. Clark is the CEO of Good Harbor Consulting, a firm that specializes in cybersecurity and risk management for both the public and private sector. Before founding Good Harbor, Mr. Clark served in the White House for 10 years as a special advisor to the President on cybersecurity and counterterrorism under Presidents George W. Bush, Clinton, and George H.W. Bush. As a cyber czar, Mr. Clark developed the first U.S. national strategy to defend cyberspace. Previous to his time at the White House, Mr. Clark served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs in the first Bush administration and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence under President Reagan. Mr. Clark taught crisis management and risk at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and MIT. He is the author of 8 books, including 2 that we'll be discussing today: Cyber War, The Next Threat to National Security and What to Do About It, and this year's Warnings, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophes. Mr. Clark, thank you. It's an honor to have you with us today.
No, it's an honor to be here.
So maybe we can start with a little bit about first CENSA. So CENSA is an organization that really started as an opportunity to give voice to professionals passionate about national security policy and the issues that they were working on. I'm curious, your own experiences. How did you get started in government, and what really was your initial passion about working in government?
Now, I'm part of that generation that heard John Kennedy's call to join government. I was, I think, 12 when John Kennedy was inaugurated, and he spoke to me. He spoke to that whole generation that there was a noble calling to go into government work. And I never thought of anything else, really. My intention from high school on was to go into government.
And in your own career, you've gone back and forth between government and academia and pursuing advanced degrees. This is often a conversation that happens with many of my peers in the professional realm about how to think about when is the right time to go back to graduate school, pursue degrees like master's or even a PhD. How did you think about when was the right time and what to think about studying when you went back and forth?
I did 5 years at the Pentagon before I went to MIT for graduate school. I thought I needed to understand better the world that I was going to be working in so that when I went to graduate school, I'd know what was going to be relevant and useful to me. I was asked at MIT to stay and get a PhD. And decided not to because I wanted to get back to work. And frankly, I didn't see for what I wanted to do in my career that a PhD was necessary. And I think that was the right call.
So now going into our discussion about cyber war and cyber deterrence. You've talked a lot about whether or not you thought deterrence applies within the cyber realm, and there is this debate within the community whether or not that is actually true. But you mentioned in the book, Cyber War, that the strategic concept of deterrence didn't necessarily apply, and you cited a few reasons to that. Namely, you didn't think that really even the United States' massive offensive cyber capability had prevented nation states from pursuing their own capabilities, as well as one of the key reasons why deterrence works is that you have to be able to signal capability, and that's particularly difficult with cyber secrecy as well as the attribution problem. Have you continued to think about this issue? Do you think deterrence still is more difficult within the cyber realm, or?
I think there are a couple of issues. If you compare nuclear deterrence to cyber deterrence, there are a couple of issues where it breaks down when you move to cyber. The first is attribution. Can you really know with a high degree of certainty who did it? I think generally we can, but not always. And if an enemy wanted to lead you astray, if an enemy wanted to lead you to think someone else had done the attack, they probably could at least cast enough doubt that it would be hard for someone to say, some leader to say, I'm going to retaliate. That's the first problem. You don't have that with nuclear deterrence because you know who's attacked you or who's tried to attack you. You see the missile coming up over the horizon and you know where it came from. The other is deterrence implies that the enemy knows what you can do to them. And they really don't when it comes to cybersecurity. We don't test our cyber weapons in a way that the enemy, whoever that is, could observe. Now, with nuclear weapons, there were over 2,000 nuclear weapons detonated in the atmosphere. Over 2,000 by the United States, the Soviet Union, France, the UK. We could see the destructive power of those tests. We knew that if you launched an ICBM with a nuclear warhead on it, there was a 99.999% probability that it would hit, and that the damage would be a given radius for the yield of the weapon. We have no idea that's true for cyber. We have very rarely used our cyber weapons. We don't like to say what they are in advance. If you reveal how they work in advance, the enemy can maybe block them. So that key element to deterrence, knowing what we can do to the enemy, is missing. So I don't think it translates.
Now, recently, we've seen that the White House has elevated U.S. Cyber Command to the status of a military combatant command. Mm-hmm. Do you think that changes the equation at all? Are we providing a little bit more transparency about our capabilities and our willingness to be able to use cyber weapons?
Not simply because we've made Cyber Command a full command, no. But I think the Pentagon, over the course of the last few years of the Obama administration, took on a couple of the key issues. By saying, what is a cyber attack, and what will we do in response to a cyber attack? What are the rules of engagement? And basically, the Pentagon said, and the President approved, that we don't care whether the attack is cyber or kinetic. We will judge it by the magnitude of its effect. And we will respond however we choose. We will not necessarily respond to a cyber attack with a cyber attack. So getting that on the record, I think, helped a lot.
Jumping over to the defense of the private sector, a recurring theme in your book is that the U.S. government really hasn't been involved in coordinating or assisting the private sector in their defense. Oftentimes people believe that market forces are sufficient to be able to provide impetus for the private sector to govern themselves, to protect themselves, and really there's not a lot of government regulation needed to be able to do that. But over the last few years, we've seen major high-profile attacks, Sony Pictures being one of them, being attacked by North Korea. Do you think that argument still holds true, that there's enough incentive for the private sector to defend themselves? And do you think that the government has a role in being able to assist the private sector to defend themselves in the cyber realm?
Well, since we wrote the book, which is now almost 7 years ago, the federal government has greatly stepped up what it's doing to help the private sector. But it's haphazard. It's very much hit or miss. And it depends on the sector that the company is in, and it depends upon what agency might provide the assistance. I mean, frankly, if you're attacked today, you're a private company, depending upon the nature of your business, you can turn to the Defense Department, the Homeland Security Department, the FBI, the Secret Service. It's a bit confusing. And what will they do for you? Will they tell you about the attack beforehand? Well, maybe. Maybe they'll provide some intelligence, stripped down. Sometimes it's stripped down so much you have no idea what it means. Will they help you figure out how to clean up your system? Probably not. You'll still have to go out and hire a private company to do that. So the role of the federal government, I think, is still unclear in helping the private sector. As a matter of policy, the Obama administration, and before that the Bush administration, said we don't think cybersecurity can be achieved by regulation. But if there's market failure, we'll think about it. Well, if this isn't market failure, I don't know what is. Every company in every sector has been hacked. And That looks like market failure to me. But despite the government saying, as a matter of policy, we won't regulate, we are regulating. And there's this crazy quilt of regulation. There's financial regulation, if you're a financial organization, a bank, or an insurance company. There are 8 federal regulators who have cybersecurity regulations. If you're a healthcare organization, there's a whole different set of standards around privacy information under the HIPAA law. Some of the existing regulatory agencies, like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, regulate sectors like the power grid. Not very well, but they do regulate it. And so we really have a mixture of regulation, not consistently applied, not thought out, confusing for companies, and not very helpful for companies.
Now, when it comes to the government response, where do you see those lines of authorities being delineated? Is this mostly Department of Homeland Security, or does the Department of Defense have a role, whether that's active or reserve forces, maybe contributing to cybersecurity? How should the government organize itself to be able to coordinate with the private sector?
Well, today, if you call the federal government and you're a major corporation, and you say, we have a cybersecurity problem, we think we've been hacked, normally the FBI and the Homeland Security Department together will come and talk to you, unless you're a defense-related company, in which case it will be the Defense Department and the FBI that will come and talk to you. But again, what they will do to help you isn't clear in advance and varies case to case.
Now, when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure, you mentioned power grids being one of them. Initially, you recommended that you thought that critical infrastructure should be completely removed from the public internet as a means to prevent these types of attacks. Mm-hmm. What we've seen, though, since you've written the book, with Stuxnet being a good example, is that this thing called the thing we call an air gap is not always a sufficient defense, that there are ways to be able to penetrate those networks even when they're not connected to the public internet. Has that changed some of your thinking, or do you think that we still need to, when it comes to the critical infrastructure, completely remove them as one of the first steps towards guaranteeing the security?
When the internet first really started in a major way, to be tied to the economy and tied to big companies in the 1990s, I suggested that certain functions ought not to be on the internet. And then we ought to have parallel networks. For example, we ought to have a parallel network for the federal government with its own fiber. That got a lot of people upset because it turned out that the people who started the internet, or like to claim that they're the creators of the internet, have a philosophy, which is everything should be connected. And it violates their sort of religious philosophy to say that there would be parallel networks, not connected. I still think that there are functions that should be considered an intranet, if you will. Something entirely separate fiber, separate routers, and I think certain federal activities should be that way. Now, actually, some are. The intelligence community, part of it at least, has its own network. The Defense Department, in certain parts of the Defense Department, has its own network with its own fiber. I think in general that's a good way to go, and part of the critical infrastructure should probably be built that way as well. But you're right, air gapping, what people think is air gapping, in, for example, the electric power grid, doesn't really occur. And what we see time and time again is that you can go to a power company, electric power company's publicly facing website, and from there jump into their internal administrative management network. and from there jump into their control network, because there are pathways. The electric power companies initially said there weren't any such pathways, but every time the government went in to find them, it found them. And so it is possible. And hackers have demonstrated that. Hackers have been able to get into the control networks of electric power companies in the US and overseas.
And I think that provides a really good example that the cyber defense realm is really a collective security problem. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes people lack the individual incentives to do good cyber behavior by updating their antivirus, by updating their operating system, by not clicking on suspicious emails that may be phishing attacks. But the reality is that when people, individuals, do not do the right cyber behavior, it exposes the entire collective to vulnerabilities. Whether that's a contractor that sticks a thumb drive into his laptop and then brings that laptop into the nuclear power plant and then introduces a virus, or someone at your firm clicks on a phishing attack and then suddenly you're exposed because you trust an email coming from that individual. So because it's a collective security problem, are there ways that we should think about from a public policy perspective, ways to mitigate this like we do with pollution or public health crises or national defense?
Yeah, I think so. I think we cannot educate our way out of this. Mm-hmm. You know, many companies and many government agencies think we have to educate our workforce so they won't click on that phishing email. That doesn't work. No matter how many times you train someone, no matter how much education you give them about phishing attacks, one day they're going to slip up. And so the system has to be designed to withstand that kind of mistake. And when an individual subnet hasn't been patched and is at critical risk, it needs to be disconnected. We need to know in any corporation or any government agency, we need to know what's on the network, number one, and what its state is, number two. Typically we don't. When you actually do network discovery, we find about 15 to 20% more is on the network than the administrators thought was on the network. So there's this shadow IT. And if they don't know it's there, they can't keep it up to date in terms of its patching and security. So number one is network discovery. Number two is knowing the state of what's on the network, not at a given point in time, but continuously. So you need a continuous monitoring function that identifies what the vulnerabilities are. And if something is added to the network, a virtual machine pops up for half an hour. If some subnet isn't patched, it needs to be shut off. It needs to be disconnected. So it's not rocket science. It can be done with existing technologies. A, to do network discovery. B, to do continuous monitoring. And C, to separate parts of the network that are putting the whole network at risk.
Which is easier said than done when we're talking about controlled intranets, but when it comes to the larger internet, that's very difficult, mm-hmm. right? No, it's interesting. I was also curious, when it comes to these collective problems, whether or not you thought maybe the government should provide free antivirus to every citizen as part of a routine based package, or whether or not actually there should be penalties for people that don't provide proper cyber security behavior.
I think there should be penalties for data loss. Mm-hmm. My co-author of Cyber War, Rob Kanaki, has suggested there's a parallel here between the way that we handled oil spills and the way that we should handle data spills.
Right.
What Rob has said is we had a lot of oil spills by ships in the past. And the government, rather than telling you how to design your ship, said instead, we will fine you, the operator, by the gallon for everything that you spill. This caused the industry to come up with new standards, double-hulled ships, other techniques. and the amount of oil spilled was massively reduced because there were penalties, there were fines. If we say to companies, we're not going to tell you how to secure your network, we're just going to tell you you have to do it. And for every bit of personally identifiable information that is compromised by someone breaking into your network, you're going to pay a fine. What if it were some low level of fine, $10? $10 for Equifax times 143 million. I think people would suddenly realize they have to take cybersecurity more seriously. Now, the fact is, people today, both in government and in industry, have not properly priced in the cost of security. And why is that? It goes back to the early 1990s, the mid-1990s, when suddenly we thought, oh, if we move all of this functionality onto networks, we can greatly reduce cost. And we did. Manpower costs, manpower numbers were reduced enormously. And if you look at American productivity during the 1990s, it skyrocketed. It skyrocketed largely because that was a period of transition in every industry into the IT revolution, the IT world. At the time, security risks were not that bad. You could take care of your security risk by antivirus, firewall, an intrusion detection system, maybe even an intrusion prevention system. That was cheap. So we got the notion back then, when we made this transition, that number one, making the IT transition saves a lot of money. And number two, the security cost associated with it is relatively cheap. Well, guess what? It's not. It's not anymore. The cost of security is probably 3 or 4 times what it was back then. If you look at companies that are doing a good job on IT security, they're spending 8, 10, 12% of their IT budget on cybersecurity. And if you look at companies that get hacked and ask that question, it's 3% of their IT budget, 5% of their IT budget. Now look, I know those are gross measures. And I know there are definitional issues about what's in the IT budget and what isn't. But the overall point that I'm trying to make here is we as a society have not priced in security into the price of using IT systems. We have improperly priced it. And as long as we continue that, as long as we think we can do it on the cheap, we will be hacked. It's really expensive to secure a network.
So how do you bring that same level of seriousness and appreciation of the risk to the government itself? I was one of the people that lost my data for the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management hack, right? I have a lot of my peers in the government that were quite upset about that. How does the government also, because they're under different cost motivations, right? They're not necessarily pricing this as a private company would. How do you bring about that seriousness?
Well, you can also, I also lost all of my data to the Chinese government thanks to the OPM hack. The OPM hack is a case in point. OPM could not possibly in a million years hope to create a cyber defense system that would stand up against the Chinese PLA unit that was attacking it. It was a crazy idea to think they could. And one of the problems is we think every little government agency, of which there are many, can do IT security. They can't. And that's why I think the White House is on the right track with saying that security should be a shared service. Fine for the Pentagon and the intelligence community to try to do it for themselves. But for the Interior Department and all of its agencies, the Labor Department, the Agriculture Department, they all do important work. The Commerce Department, you may not think so, but they all do important work. The Commerce Department runs the Weather Bureau, the Tsunami Warning Center, the Atomic Clock. There are all sorts of important functions performed in federal government agencies. They should not be asked to create islands of security there should be a federal IT security function. I don't care where you put it in GSA, put it in Homeland Security, it doesn't matter. There should be one federal IT security function for all of those civilian agencies that just can't do it.
Yeah. And so that doesn't currently exist. Right now,
it doesn't.
All the bureaucracies are managing it independently.
Yes, but the White House is moving in that direction.
Yep.
And it is possible now for one federal agency to say, I can't do it, and to allow their security to be assumed by another agency.
Now, the federal government obviously takes an outsized role in defending against attacks like that. But when we look at personal data, oftentimes individual states carry actually much more potentially harmful personal data if exposed than the federal government.
Right.
What should the relationship then be between federal government and individual states in trying to help secure their data as well?
Well, the states vary widely in their ability to secure their data. And you're right, states have an enormous amount of sensitive data, tax records and other records. The National Governors Association has taken a step in the right direction because this year, with Governor McAuliffe of Virginia in the chair, this year was cybersecurity year for the National Governors Association. And we had an outside rating agency come in and rate each of the 50 states in terms of their performance on cybersecurity. And when all 50 governors, plus the territories, got together, each was handed in a sealed envelope a grade. And only they got to see the grade for their state. But you could see on their faces when they opened the envelope, a lot of them got failing grades. Mm-hmm. So you're right. State governments, even city governments, have a lot of sensitive data, a lot of important networks that typically are not secured.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there some example states that are doing a good job that you've seen that you can highlight to the community?
Well, I think California is, New York is, Virginia is, Michigan is, Rhode Island is starting to. And it's because in each of those states, the governor got it. The governor realized it was important. And the governor created an outside panel, brought in industry experts and federal government experts to advise the governor. That was done in all of those states, and it made a difference.
Mm-hmm. It also seems that you discuss a lot about countries like China that have their great firewall that has a lot more protections than the United States has, right? They're able to control access of their networks in and out through the routers and the major pipelines coming in. They're also able to police their own network through combinations of actual government bureaucracies doing that, or as well as automated tools that do that. That provides clear advantages when it comes to cyber defense that countries like us do not have. But you've often discussed that when it comes to how high our vulnerabilities are, as well as the dramatic consequences that a major cyber attack would have on our way of life, do you think that we need to go to a more structured cyber defense method that the Chinese do, for example?
No. The United States has many portals in and out of the country. It's easy for Singapore or Israel, which probably have 2 portals in and out of the country. And it's easy for China to control the flow in and out. But we have a strong sense of civil liberties here. And we're never going to let the government control the flow in and out of our country of knowledge on the internet, of information on the internet. That's not the government's job. What the government can do, however, is ask the providers, ask the people who run the backbone, and there are only 4 or 5 companies that are running the big fiber backbone, to do some basic hygiene. They can and should be looking for botnets, be looking for DDoS attacks. They can even look down at the packet level for executables. So it's not the government that should be doing that, because in the United States we wouldn't like that in terms of our civil liberties tradition. But we can tell the carriers as a condition of licensure, the FCC could tell them, you have to do that.
What do you think the trends are when we look at the rest of the world, though, when it comes to this? Obviously, like you said, we have we put our personal liberties and, on a high pedestal when it comes to open access on the internet, but really other countries are taking different approaches, and that some fear that there's this balkanization of the internet where it's just segmented intranets between national boundaries. Do you have any observations of where we're seeing trends for other countries and how they approach, how they're structuring their internet?
Well, look, that's happened. It's happened that there are different procedures in different countries. We just have to accept that. The Europeans have a much higher standard than we do for privacy, for example. And so data storage is done in a very different way in Europe than it is in the United States. We have to accept that there will be different standards. What I think the United States has to ask itself is, could we achieve higher standards? Could we adopt some of the things that the Europeans have done on data privacy? I think that's worth looking at. Really, the reason we haven't done that is the influence of Google, Facebook, and other people who want to use information about us to sell ads. That's the major reason that the Europeans have a higher privacy standard than we do.
Jumping in the topic of the military's role in cyber war, you wrote in your book, a nation that has invented the new technology and the tactics to use it may not be the victor. If its own military is mired in the ways of the past, overcome by inertia, overconfident in the weapons they have grown to love and consider supreme. I was particularly struck by that line. Me being a student of military history, have looked at many case studies in the past of countries and nations that have learned the wrong lessons of the previous conflict. One of my favorite examples is the 1866 Austro-Prussian War, where the Prussians soundly defeated the Austrians, and the French, who were very concerned about the rise of Prussia at the time, looked on that conflict and they said it was technology. It was the rifle that the Prussians used. And so the French adapted their entire military to rely on their newest rifle and a more defensive scheme. The Prussians, though, in that example, took away completely different lessons. To them, it was about maneuver, and it was about decentralized command, what they call Auftragstaktik. And 4 years later, in 1870, the Prussians, within a few months, defeated the French and marched all the way to Paris. Right? So that's an example of observing the same phenomenon and conflicts happening and taking away very different lessons, right, to ultimate failure on the French's side. Do you think the military is observing the right lessons learned and observing the cyber context of what's happening right now? And we're seeing many different countries do many different things, right? The Chinese are utilizing cyber techniques mostly for wealth extraction, for stealing technology. The Russians are using it for information operations to influence the electoral process, for example. How about the United States? Are we really taking away the right lessons learned to better prepare ourselves for potential future cyber conflict?
I don't think so. I think the number one thing that we need to do is defensive. The military traditionally doesn't like to hear that. The military traditionally wants to think of the offense as the best defense. It's not in this case, in the case of cyber war. If your weapon systems don't work, if your conventional weapon systems don't work because they've been hit by a cyber attack, if your comms don't work, then your offense won't work, including your cyber offense. And frankly, it does us very little good to have great cyber offense if we have no cyber defense. And our defense is inadequate. You mentioned the Russians using psychological operations today, not just to affect elections. They're using it to go after individual troops, going to their individual devices, sending them messages, tracking them. In World War II, the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese had broadcasters who would broadcast in English out to the U.S. troops to try to hurt their morale. Now, that will happen in the pre-war period today with the Russians going after individual soldiers with Facebook messages and tweets and trying to break their morale. And also try to break their comms and it will track them using their devices. We're not doing a very good job of preparing for that. Nor, frankly, are we doing a very good job of being sure that the code that we need to run our very advanced weapons is really secure. We've done a terrible job of allowing defense contractors to have inadequate security on their own systems. So that before the F-35 flew, information about it was in China as a result of Chinese hacking. That's true across the board with our weapon systems. China and Russia know a lot about our weapon systems as a result of hacking. Have they implanted anything in the code? Would we know? Have we done an adequate job of looking, constantly looking in that code? I think the answer there, too, is no. What about in the chipsets? If you look at all the chips in an F-22, some of them have been made in U.S. government facilities. Some of them have been X-rayed to make sure that there's nothing additional that shouldn't be there, but not all of them. And if you do that kind of analysis of the underlying code and the underlying hardware, not just in the weapon systems themselves, but in the support structure that's necessary for an air base to work or a Navy base to work, there's so many possible vulnerabilities. No, we haven't done a good job on defense. And I'm much more concerned about that than I am about how good we are on the offense.
So you would say that we've mostly taken a threat-based approach rather than a risk-based vulnerability assessment approach when it comes to cyber warfare.
And that's absolutely right. And I know it's difficult to do a thorough risk-based approach. And I know it's difficult to get code and hardware that is highly secure and you have high confidence in that. It greatly increases the cost of procurement. I get that. But if you if you have these marvelously advanced technological systems and you think you're going to win the war because you have a better technology than the other guy does, and then when it comes time to actually use it, you trot that technology out on the battlefield and it doesn't work, what have you got to fall back on? Not much.
Right. Finally, I want to talk about international norms when it comes to cyber warfare. So at the time of your book, you had really articulated a hope that the world could develop rules and norms governing cyber behavior. For example, no first use, no use on civilian infrastructure, leading to potential arms control agreements. Also, no use of logic bombs when it comes to infrastructure that civilians rely on. Do you think that norms are still the best way to shape state behavior? And are we any closer to working towards establishing some of those international norms?
I think there's some value in norms. And look, I know enemy states are going to break them at some point. That doesn't mean they're valueless. In peacetime, there's some value to having norms. And when a nation state violates international norms, there needs to be a cost. There needs to be a penalty. Now, we're a long way from that. We've got the Budapest Convention on cybercrime, but no penalties for not cooperating with it, not living up to its requirements. We could build on that Budapest Convention, but how would we do that? We would do that by saying nations need to cooperate with each other. There's an obligation to do that. So if I'm Argentina and I say that there's a criminal in Brazil who's attacking facilities in Argentina and Brazil is not cooperating, you can go to some international mechanism. And that international mechanism can investigate. Is Brazil actually a scofflaw? Is Brazil not abiding by the international norms? And if that turns out to be the case, then there should be some sanction, there should be some penalty. It begins with having an international obligation to assist each other. Because, frankly, today the U.S. does a very bad job of it. You know, the Chinese are constantly saying about the United States, we too get attacked, says China. We get attacked from people in the United States. And when we ask the U.S. to do something about it, they don't. And they're right. If you ask the U.S. today for help because you're being attacked by someone in the U.S., it takes months for the U.S. to respond. So we need a capability of responding quickly and helping people so that we can turn around and say we need that same sort of quick response. And we need some sort of inspection, international inspection mechanism to see if countries are not holding up to their international obligations. Think about the IAEA, the nuclear agency. So I can go, as one country, I can go to the IAEA today and say, I think that country is not living up to the treaty. Please go check it out. And the host country has an obligation to accept inspection from the IAEA. And an international team will go in and inspect and come back and issue a report. If that report says that the country is violating the agreement, then that report goes to the UN Security Council, which considers sanctions. That's the kind of model we need for cyberspace.
Do you see an institution that provides that currently existing within the UN framework?
No.
So that's something that we would have to continue to push for the creation of.
We'd have to create it, and it shouldn't be in the UN framework, because there are a lot of problems with the UN framework. It can be a standalone agency, and it can be initially just like-minded states. It doesn't have to include everybody. It doesn't have to include Russia. It may not have to include China at the beginning. Like-minded states that get together and agree on the norms. And if you have people like Russia and China in on the beginning, negotiating those norms, then the norms may end up being watered down.
Right.
So get Western Europe, Japan, some of our closer allies together, create an ad hoc organization, international organization, create some norms, create some structure, and go from there.
Right. And really the idea then is once you can show value added to international actors where their issues are actually being aired out and resolved, then that's incentive then for other countries to join in.
And create that series of norms, and then say to countries around the world, you have to pass those norms. We did this with money laundering. We got together a group of like-minded nations, and we agreed on what a good money laundering law would look like. And we all passed it. We all passed the same law in 28 nations, I think. And then we said to other countries that were scofflaws, you have to pass the same law, and you have to enforce it. And if you don't, there will be penalties. That worked.
Changing topics a little bit. So talking about emerging national security issues. So your recent book this year, Warnings, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophe, opens up with the Greek tragedy of Cassandra of Troy. Can you tell us a little bit about who was Cassandra and why is that important to us today?
Well, first of all, she was right. That's the number one thing to begin with. Cassandra was a woman in Greek mythology who was cursed by the gods. And the curse was that she could see the future. Now, that doesn't sound like a curse, right? But the second part of it was she could see disasters coming, but no one would ever believe her. And it drove her mad, because she would run around telling people, this is about to happen. You need to stop. You need to pay attention to this. And no one ever would. So she went crazy. But the thing about Cassandra worth remembering is, in every case, she was right. And so what the book is about are experts, not people who wake up in the middle of the night with an idea, but experts who are data-driven, who have an empirical basis for their analysis, and are recognized in their field as experts, but who are outliers from the other experts, and who say, there's a problem, it's coming, we need to do something about it, and they're ignored. This turns out to be a phenomenon. We didn't know that when we started the research. We had a feeling that this might be the case. When we did the research, we found out over and over again, in every field of endeavor, this happens. It happens for a lot of reasons having to do with cognitive biases. But when someone comes to you, you're a decision maker, you're the President of the United States, you're CEO of the company, someone comes to you and says, you have to stop working on what you're working on. You have to work on what I want you to work on, because if you don't, there'll be a terrible disaster. You have to shift your attention, you have to shift resources to this issue that you weren't looking at. Now, the decision maker typically doesn't like to do that. And so the decision maker says, well, what do all the other experts think? And initially, all the other experts will disagree, because this person has identified the risk before anybody else has. And so the book goes through 14 case studies in a variety of different fields and tries to distill ways of identifying when that kind of phenomenon is going on.
Now, in those case studies, what did you find were some of those common characteristics of all these Cassandras out there that were right?
Well, there are common characteristics of the Cassandras, of the decision makers, of the issue, the type of issue, and actually of the critics as well. So there are 4 different kinds of characteristics. Basically, for the decision maker is often swayed by the fact that what is being predicted has never happened before. And we call this first occurrence syndrome. And a decision maker will say, well, yeah, I see that evidence. I see what you're saying, but that's never happened. Well, of course it's never happened. What is history but a list of things that happened for the first time?
Right. Or at least in recent memory.
Yeah, or at least in recent memory. We talk about the case of the Fukushima disaster, where the engineer expert said, don't build nuclear reactors here because there's a chance of a tsunami. And Tokyo Electric said, no, you're crazy. There hasn't been a tsunami. No one has ever had a tsunami here. And he said, oh, yes, there was, but it was 400 years ago. Well, they said the records from 400 years ago are imprecise, they're exaggerated. Nothing could ever get that bad at this location. Well, of course it did, with enormously tragic results. And for the cost of a little bit of more resilience at that site, Tokyo Electric would have saved hundreds of billions of dollars in damages.
Now, you cited in Warnings Philip Tetlock, who's one of my favorite authors. He recently, or not recently, but he wrote the book Super Forecasting.
Right.
And the premise behind super forecasting was that there are ways for us to hone our skills about being able to predict and correctly interpret the future. Did you also find that with your research into Cassandras? Are there ways that you would recommend that practitioners can especially try to hone those skills?
Well, what Tetlock says is that almost anybody can get good at this. And that there are people who are just good at forecasting, and you can drop them into almost any field, and they'll be good at it. We actually disagree with that. What we found is you really need someone who is an expert in the field. You can't bring in someone from outside who's just generally good at forecasting. You need someone who is an expert in the field, who has been recognized for their past work, and who has done an empirical study that has led to the conclusion that there's a problem. Organizations can improve. Organizations can look for those kinds of people and give them their day in court. And we have a little 22-factor matrix which we use to apply to these people to say whether or not it's probable that they're right. We can't say, yes, they're definitely going to be right. But we can say the reasons they are being ignored are the wrong reasons.
Right. And you also mentioned that one of the problems that these Cassandras have is that oftentimes they're not necessarily listened to by the other experts within their community, right? So if you apply maybe a TEDLOC model and bring somebody that's maybe just good at forecasting, that further amplifies the problems of trying to get people to listen that there's an issue there.
Well, often the other experts in their field say, well, that data is interesting, but it's not dispositive. We need to do more testing. And we call this scientific reluctance, because very often applying the scientific technique precisely and doing lots of testing and lots of replication of the tests takes up more time than we have. If you wait, the classic case is Jim Hansen in the book, who's the climate scientist, who talks about sea level rise being much worse in the near future than the other experts believe. And his critics say, well, he hasn't used the scientific method. He hasn't done enough study. He hasn't replicated enough. And he comes back and he says, look, I've got my data, but if you want me to use the scientific method, what do you want me to do? Melt Greenland several times? And if we wait for that level of proof, it'll be too late.
Well, also part of the problem, it seems like, is that when it comes to how we structure policy, especially in the United States, it's all short-term thinking, right? It's around 4-year election cycles or even 2-year congressional cycles. And there's a difficulty to really look at these problems that are long-term in nature, right? Do you think countries like China that come up with 50-year, 100-year plans maybe have an advantage over us in that? And how do we overcome this very short-term, immediate problem focus that really prevents us from being able to address the long-term issues?
Well, long-term planning often doesn't work. At least we've seen that in the past with communist governments and their long-term planning. But we have a vulnerability that is the flip side of that. We can't invest more than on a 3-year or 4-year horizon. Politicians come in, they want a quick fix. They want to be able to say, here's something I've done so they can get reelected. And they're not investing in the future, and they don't want to. So there is some advantage to long-term planning. There is some advantage to being able to have a system that focuses on things that go beyond the lifetime of any one president or one Congress.
Traditionally, there's also this dichotomy or relationship between academics and government practitioners. Oftentimes bureaucrats or politicians complain that what's being produced in academia is not necessarily useful because sometimes it's so nuanced, so specific. Did you see in your research looking at Cassandra's whether or not there was more of a benefit being a practitioner versus academic, or do you need a mixture of both?
I think you need a mixture of both. It's certainly the case. I taught at the Kennedy School for 5 years. And the beauty of the Kennedy School is we mixed faculty members who were practitioners, who had been in charge of government programs, with academic experts who had never really left the academy. And that mixture, I think, was great for the students because there's some value to each of them. And it's in the tension between the two that the students really learn. All too often, people in the government are focused on what's immediately in front of them. And they're missing new ideas, new techniques. They're missing the larger picture in which they're operating. And yet, people from academia very frequently have very great ideas that are utterly impractical. And when it comes down to actually getting things done in the government.
That's right. And ultimately, it really comes to this dialectic that happens between theory and practice. Theory informs how we practice and create policy, but also you need that feedback then to improve our theories, which are always incomplete.
And we also need to teach how to get things done. All too often we see courses in particular issue areas or in theory, but not in toolkits. The course that I taught with Rand Beers at the Kennedy School was National Security Management, how to get stuff done, where we said in the first class, if you want to talk about policy analysis, take another course. This is not about policy analysis. We're going to assume when we start this course that whatever policy you're working on has already been determined by the president or by the Congress. and your job is to implement it. How do you do that? What are the tools that you need to understand, the basic tools of federal budgeting, of communications and public relations, of congressional relations, of interagency management? No one really teaches those things in most public policy schools.
You also mentioned that, so your ultimate recommendation within the book is that we need to do a better job about identifying these Cassandras,
right,
so that we can prevent many of these calamities. And so you recommend being able to create a national warnings office to be able to, again, identify those Cassandras. You know, going back to what you were just talking about having the tool sets to be able to, you know, properly manage government, what does that national warning office look like? What is the resume for the people on there? What are the tool sets that they have to identify these Cassandras within the community?
For a long time, we had a national warning office in the intelligence community, and for reasons I'll never understand, it was shut down. It was very valuable because it was a bunch of people who were iconoclasts, who knew how the intelligence community worked, who knew how collection worked, who knew how analysis worked, but were independent thinkers and were skeptics. I think that's the kind of thing we need at a national level. It doesn't have to be an enormous organization. It can be a handful of people. It could be a dozen people who are analysts and who are skeptics and who are constantly looking in unusual places for minority opinions and looking over the horizon, who do not have a responsibility to worry about issues today, but who have a responsibility to look out. We talk about it as sentinel intelligence. We found an Israeli professor, psychiatrist, who said there is something called sentinel intelligence. He said some people have it and some people don't. He describes it as highly functioning high anxiety. So you can function fine in society, but you're the kind of person who's always asking, in any setting, what can go wrong? He said these people are the first people to smell fire in a restaurant if there's a fire in the kitchen. And they don't say to other people around them, gee, do you smell fire? They smell it and they know it's fire, and they act on their own determination, and they get up and they pull the fire alarm. There actually are people in every profession who have that kind of high-functioning, high anxiety, who are good risk managers. That's what it comes down to. They're constantly asking, what can go wrong?
So when it comes to what can go wrong, so you identify several scenarios in the future, but in evaluating likelihood, or at least the seriousness that we should take some of these, you develop the Cassandra coefficient. The ones that had the highest coefficient were problems or calamities that may be associated with genetic engineering, sea level rise, and secondary and tertiary consequences of the Internet of Things, and where all that may lead us to. What do you think is, you can refer to that list, or you can go continue to give us some more ideas, but what are some of the emerging threats that you think that we need to start taking seriously and that kind of keep you up at night?
Of all of the scenarios we looked at, the one that's the most troublesome, most bothersome, is sea level rise. If our Cassandra, Jim Hansen, is right, the UN model is wrong. The UN model is pretty bad. The UN model says possibility by 2100 of sea level rise by as much as 3 meters. Now that'll have enormous effect if that's true. What Hansen says, however, is that there's a much more rapid sea level rise about to happen because of a feedback loop. And there's an accelerator in the phenomenon of glacier melt. He says we could have 6 to 9 meters, and sooner than 2100, 2050, 2075. Now, if that's right, that will be the most significant event in human history. We'll have to have hundreds of millions of people around the Earth migrate away from the flooded lands. We'll have to abandon cities with trillions of dollars of infrastructure. We'll try to save some of them. That will cost a lot. We'll have to replace some of them. That will cost a lot. And the insurance costs, the mortgage losses, will threaten the economy of countries all around the world. So we could have a great economic collapse. We also have to ask ourselves, where do we get that money to do that kind of new infrastructure build? And at the same time, maintain national defense and maintain basic welfare programs. No one has done the econometric modeling associated at a macro level with global sea level rise. And I think we have to. I don't know how it will turn out in terms of the economic model, but my gut tells me it'll be disastrous.
And you know, you talk a little bit about the cognitive biases that prevent us from seeing it, but one of those is that human beings tend to think in linear
Right.
means.
Yep.
But the reality is the natural world very rarely operates on a linear scale. It's all nonlinear, exponential, logarithmic scales. And I think that's definitely the case with sea level rise, that this is not going to be a predictable increase. Very well, it could be overnight.
Well, it won't be gentle and gradual. We're already seeing it. You see it today in Norfolk. You see it today in Miami Beach and other places. But what Jim Hansen and now a growing number of other people are saying is that glaciers will get to a point where there's enormous amount of calving of glaciers in Greenland and in the north and Antarctica in the south. And that will happen in a way that causes the currents in the ocean to break down. And we'll have enormous climate change, negative climate change happening all at once. And the sea level can jump, as you said. After a gradual bit of increase, it could jump all at once.
I really appreciate the insight that you brought in Warnings. I'm excited for also your next book. Do you want to give us a hint on what you're thinking about, what you're wrestling with for your next work?
Well, Rob Kanaki and I wrote Cyber War 7 years ago. And we are seriously beginning the thought process on writing a sequel called Cyber Peace. And Cyber Peace says, you know, we're kind of already at war. Not the way we defined it in the book, but there's a high level of hostilities going on in cyberspace today. Nation state to nation state and criminal cartels involved. How do we ratchet that down? What is the program? What is the multi-year, multi-step program that we should be pursuing to get down from where we are now, rather than accelerating into actual out-and-out war? Are there things that we can do now to decelerate, to de-escalate? Some of them are international norms, but there are other things we need to do as well. And I think that's our next challenge.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to that, and hopefully that can provide a framework then that the United States can really leverage on the international scene. So on behalf of CENSA, Mr. Clark, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated this conversation we have, and I wish you the best, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.